to me, the beloved community is not just about a destination. It's also about the journey to get there. That we, similar to the inner and outer conversation we had around the SDGs, we get to experience deeper connection and community on the way to building the beloved community.
This is a podcast called Walk, Talk, Listen. An attempt to connect people and make this world a bit better by sharing opinions and experiences based on the belief that everyone's perspective is true, albeit partial. My name is Maurice Blom, and I would like to welcome you to yet another episode of Walk, Talk, Listen.
Good day, everybody. This is another episode of the podcast Walk, Talk, Listen. And as always, I'm delighted with today's guest who will introduce himself. Adam, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Maurice. It's great to be on with you. I'm Reverend Adam Russell Taylor. I currently have the privilege of serving as the president of Sojourners. We're a 50-year-old peace and justice organization that works with Christians of all stripes, but also people of faith and conscience, to inspire and equip them to put their faith into action for justice. And certainly can share more about the work and mission of Sojourners later. But, a lot of my story is tied into kind of my origin story, starting with my parents. And they made the controversial decision to get married in 1968. It's controversial because my mother is Black and my father's white. That was a pretty unpopular decision back then. They got married just a year after interracial marriage was legalized in the United States through the case Loving versus the state of Virginia. And they instilled in me a really deep and abiding belief, really two beliefs. One, that we are all made in the image of God, the likeness and image of God. And as a result, our diversity, first kind of my diversity as a biracial Black man, but also in a larger sense, our nation's diversity and our world's diversity is an incredible and special gift and not a weakness or a liability. And the other is that my generation, Generation X, but also subsequent generations after the civil rights struggle inherited the unfinished business of that movement. And so I became really mesmerized, kind of infatuated with the civil rights struggle from an early age. I, read as much as I could get my hands on. I became really a huge fan of the Eyes on the Prize series. And I learned very quickly that Dr. King, but also so many other civil rights leaders, had a very global understanding of the civil rights movement, that it wasn't just about the United States, it was also about human dignity all across the world. And then part of the unfinished business of that movement was around economic justice. It was around trying to ensure that the full promise of this nation was extended to everyone, of equal justice under law and liberty and justice for all. And so that has kind of animated a lot of my career. I ultimately kind of wrestled with a call to ministry. It's another story I can tell later if you're interested, but ultimately did come to this kind of epiphany that my distinctive call to ministry was not to be a pastor of a church, but to really try to reawaken and revitalize a commitment to justice within the church broadly. And so I ultimately get ordained in the American Baptist Church and the Progressive National Baptist Church, which is the denomination that Dr. King helped to inspire, and do serve in ministry at Alfred Street Baptist Church just outside of DC. But I really feel like kind of my core sense of calling is, again, kind of working with the church in an ecumenical way to try to help Christians see a commitment to justice, not as a extracurricular activity, but as something part and parcel to Christian discipleship, and to really try to deepen a commitment to justice across the church, which is more than kind of a commitment to compassion and charity. That is really important and is also an expression of Christian discipleship. But I would kind of argue biblically, a commitment to justice requires us to get underneath the root causes of injustice, to address issues of exploitation, of domination, of violence, of exclusion from community. And so that's kind of been the kind of core work that I try to be committed to and continue through Sojourners.
Great, and thanks for sharing that, Adam. And can you, if you take us back to, because you said you're inspired by your parents. I mean, and if you look back at your youth, at your upbringing, was there a moment where you realized that this is part of me, and yeah, if so, can you share that with us?
Yeah, so I had an opportunity when I was young. I'm trying to remember kind of the exact age. Probably about similar ages that my two sons are right now, which are 9 and 11, to travel to Chicago. So I grew up in a place called Bellingham, Washington. It's a really beautiful place. It's a little bit sheltered and relatively homogenous, but it was a great place to grow up. And my parents kind of started a life there, partly because they both got jobs at Western Washington University. My dad was a psychology professor, and then my mom kind of rose up through the ranks and ultimately became the first Black woman to be a vice president at Western Washington University. But I took this trip when I was somewhere around 10 years old to Chicago, and my uncle, my mom's only brother, had started a bus company and was friends with Harold Washington, who became the first Black mayor of Chicago. And he gave us this tour of Chicago, particularly the south side of Chicago. And it just kind of removed these scales from my eyes about the degree of economic racialized inequality in the country, but in particular in Chicago. And certainly it's not like I was completely blind. I mean, I had seen some of this through television, et cetera, but I think it just became much more clear and much more urgent to me, just the degree to which our kind of opportunity is still so racialized in this country. And so that was kind of one defining experience. Another one was when I was about 12 years old. I went on a trip with my parents across Southeast Asia. We went to Japan, we went to Thailand, we went to Indonesia and Singapore, et cetera. And it was kind of my first kind of major international trip. And I think that trip kind of really sparked my passion for kind of international development and trying to be a champion for human rights. And in particular in Thailand, I was really confronted with the sex industry and kind of human trafficking, which, as a 10-year-old, or I guess at that point more like 12 or 13, was still pretty jarring. And that, experience also just gave me a strong sense that I wanted to try to make an impact internationally, and made me realize that we really are one globe. We're one global community that is very much interdependent. And, that I think has inspired some of the work I ended up doing around the global AIDS crisis, around debt cancellation. It's very much a part of the Jubilee 2000 movement, and continues today through kind of my advocacy around the Sustainable Development Goal agenda.
I have a question about that global, because you like to work on that. You think that's important. You did, however, decided to write a book about the country where you were born and are living in, the United States. So can you please explain, why you did that? And is it related with the global work that you do? And if so, how?
Yeah. So kind of roll back in time a little bit to 2016. It was a very consequential election in the United States, to say the least. And it was the morning after the election, and my then 5-year-old son, Joshua, came into my room, our room, my wife and I, and we kind of had restless sleep. And I don't tell this story in any way to be partisan, but, he asked us a straightforward question. He was like, "Mommy, Daddy, who won?" And we were like, "Well, we think Mr. Trump won." And he said, "I don't understand how someone who has said and done such mean things can win." And Maurice, I was literally speechless, which is kind of rare for a Baptist preacher.
Yeah.
But, I really didn't know how to respond because I was feeling this sense of anguish, not because a Republican won or someone that's more conservative than I won, but really someone that managed to win and ran a campaign that stoked so much of the worst, I think, impulses of our nation's history of racism, misogyny, xenophobia, et cetera. And it was particularly galling for me because that wasn't a deal breaker for the vast majority of white Christians in this country. And so I really felt in that moment this sense of spiritual and existential crisis. And, I was at that time, in a really comfortable position working at the World Bank. I was leading an initiative on faith, trying to build partnerships between the World Bank and faith-based organizations. And just something broke in my spirit. And it was really clear to me in the days and weeks following that election result that I couldn't really fulfill my sense of call and remain at the World Bank, that I needed to kind of get back into the fight for our democracy in one sense in the United States, but also in a larger sense, the continued struggle for full human dignity and full social justice. And so I ended up, leaving the World Bank and returning to Sojourners, entered into a multi-year leadership transition with the founder, Jim Wallace. And, that kind of led me back into this work. And I tell that story because one of the things that I was wrestling with, and this helped inspire me to write the book, is I really felt like part of the reason Trump won and why kind of Trumpism became so popular is that there wasn't a clear unifying counter narrative to the very kind of persuasive and I would say seductive "Make America Great Again" mantra and narrative. And, in many ways, "Make America Great Again" was kind of a dog whistle for, in a sense, trying to kind of hold on to this past, which certainly wasn't great for many Americans. There's certainly great things about it. But, at worst was kind of this make America white again, or keep America white and Christian, and appealed to this white nationalist sentiment that is still quite strong, and I think is still not only a danger to American democracy, but also a danger to the witness of the church in the United States and around the world. And so, I had become really inspired by the moral vision that animated the civil rights struggle, which is the vision of the beloved community. And Dr. King didn't invent it, even though he popularized it. It was really invented by a clergyman named Josiah Royce, who led the Society for Reconciliation. And Dr. King then, was very moved by it and ended up referencing it in a lot of his speeches, et cetera. And the reason why I'm so drawn to it is that it is a moral vision that I think is rooted in the best of our religious traditions, not just Christian, but also Jewish and Muslim and more. And it's rooted in the best of our civic and constitutional values. And, my most succinct definition of what the beloved community looks like, what it means, is to build a society, a nation where neither punishment nor privilege is tied to race or ethnicity or to religion or ableness or to sexual orientation, to gender. And it's to build a society where everyone is seen, is valued, is respected, and our diversity is seen as a strength and not a weakness, and everyone is enabled to thrive. And I realize that is a very big kind of vision, might sound overly idealistic, maybe even utopian. But I actually think particularly that first part is very, very measurable. We can measure through public policy whether certain people are punished disproportionately or certain people have privilege. And, we know that because of the history in the United States, both punishment and privilege have been viciously tied to race, to skin color for a very long time, creating this hierarchy of human value. And this is true in many other parts of the world, of course, in different ways. And so in order to change that, we have to really be very deliberate about what kind of commitments and what kind of policies will get us to a society where that's no longer the case. And I actually think the vast majority of Americans, let alone the vast majority of people in the world, don't want to live in communities and societies where that is the case. So anyway, that that kind of led me to write the book itself. And in the book, I really try to further unpack what the beloved community looks like. What are some core commitments? I call them beatitudes, borrowing from Jesus's famous Sermon on the Mount, that would help us, further realize the beloved community. And so they include things like a commitment to imago Dei equality, a commitment to what I call Ubuntu interdependence, a commitment to radical welcome, a commitment to dignity for all, a commitment to nonviolence, and a commitment to environmental stewardship. And, I really kind of talk about each of those and then give really concrete examples of how the beloved community is already being built in beautiful ways all across the world, all across the country. And we need to not only kind of shine a light on all these great examples, but also try to find ways to scale them up. And certainly, the work that you do at Church World Service, I think, is a great example of beloved community work, as is the work at Sojourners.
And just for the listeners to make sure, so Adam writes about this in his latest book, right? Your latest book.
Yeah. Yep.
A More Perfect Union. So you really need to check that out, and I will make sure there will be a link to the book in the notes of the podcast. Adam, so in your book you are indeed describing about this beloved community and how we need to get there ultimately. What is the role of the church, according to you, within this?
Yeah, the church has a really important role to play. I would argue that the church really should be a balm that really helps to heal some of the wounds and the hurts and the needs, meet some of the expressed needs that people have. Whether those are, in some cases, material needs like lack of food, of housing, et cetera. And I'll be careful there, because it's not the church alone that can solve those challenges. It has to be the church working in partnership with the government and other sectors. The church needs to be more of a bridge builder. I really am disheartened by the way in which the church itself and kind of Christianity has not only been hijacked in ways that I think, really destroy the witness of the church, but also that it's become either there's kind of two extremes: overly politicized, where we kind of define our faith first through the lens of our politics, rather than having our faith really to, shape and determine our politics. Or on the other extreme, this kind of notion that our faith has nothing to do with politics, this kind of apolitical understanding of faith. And I actually think both are really mistaken, or are really wrong and even dangerous. Dr. King had a great quote that I love to cite, where he said, "The church at its best is called not to be the master or the servant of the state, but to be the conscience of the state." And I think that's what we desperately need right now. We need a church that is willing to stand apart from political parties, not get co-opted within them. That's actually the mistake that the religious right movement made, was they really tried to take over the Republican Party, but I think in the process they got co-opted into it. But instead, the church should be a conscience that really forces or inspires people to prioritize the most vulnerable and most marginalized, which I think is kind of a core biblical principle that we should all agree with. Now, there are different ways in which we can achieve some of those goals through public policy, and that's where we need to have civil but real rigorous debate about what those look like. But I think that core principle is something that the church needs to be an advocate and champion of. And that's kind of the third piece, is being that conscience. So for me, the church has this transformational role to play. And when you really look at so many of the social movements that have not only reformed our politics, but transformed them, faith has been an animating, guiding force. It certainly was in the civil rights movement, but even beyond that, if you look at the kind of HIV and AIDS movement that I was a part of, that helped win huge victories around the President's Emergency AIDS Plan and the funding for the Global Fund, those wouldn't have happened without a lot of Christians advocating, not just kind of progressive Christians, but also many conservative Christians that helped to make all that possible.
I would like to piggyback on the church then, because if we are looking at the challenges in front of us, there they are most urgent maybe for the youth. I mean, it's their future. It's there now, they say even, they don't, many of those I've talked with are saying, we are not the future, we are the now. Many of them, they're not necessarily attracted by it because of the past, of the history. Then another discussion that I often have, during these virtual walks is that the younger generation maybe thinks differently about spirituality and religion. I'm not saying that is true. I mean, some are saying yes, others are saying no. So my question to you, Adam, is what do you see happening in, around you with regard to church, youth, younger generation, and religion and spirituality?
Yeah. Well, I think there's pretty huge changes that are taking place within and have been taking place within the church. I think there's a lot of young people that have left the church because they have felt excluded or have been abused by the church in different ways. Certainly the sexual scandal within the Catholic Church, although it's certainly not just exclusive of the Catholic Church, is a real black eye to the church. There was a survey done about 20 years ago by Barna, where they interviewed younger Christians about why they're leaving the church and what is the general perception of Christians of the church. And they found that the three adjectives that most described how younger Christians saw the church was that the church was judgmental, was homophobic, and was hypocritical. Now, those are kind of three qualities that don't bode well for the future of the church. And so, I think that the church has been a little bit, not just little, we have been, I'll certainly own some of this with the we have been too complacent in not only addressing some of these, scandals and serious issues, but also being, much more clear about what are the most important ways that we can live out our faith in a way that really kind of models the ethic of Jesus. I mean, the good news in all this is that most people, including young people, don't have a negative opinion of Jesus. So despite all of the challenges that the church faces, it hasn't completely tarnished the image of Jesus. When people think of Jesus, they think of, compassion and grace and love. So to me, that's the good news. Mm-hmm. I think the church has to get back to some of the basics of what does it mean to really follow Jesus? And, that's easier said than done. But, I would argue that churches that are more committed to a deep ethic of radical and unconditional love, that show a deep commitment to inclusion versus exclusion, that are deeply involved in their community, not just on the compassion side, although that's really crucial, but also trying to be advocates and work around a range of justice issues. That itself becomes one of the most powerful forms of evangelism, of sharing the good news of Christ, and will draw many of those young people back to the church. Now, some of them may never come back to the church, and I think one of the things that it's also important to do is recognize that there is like a very close link between spirituality and religion. And many of the people that are now in this kind of burgeoning group called the nuns, the spiritual but not religious, which is probably the fastest growing group in the United States right now. Mm-hmm. Many of those people still, want to have some relationship with Jesus and, might not come back to the institutional church, but still want to have kind of an active faith. There was a great study that was done by the Fetzer Institute that did a very significant survey of spirituality in America. And what they found is that, over 80% of Americans identify as spiritual, and that there's a really strong correlation between spirituality and pro-social behavior. So in other words, the more spiritual you are, the more likely you're going to be engaged in community service. It's more likely that you're going to be engaged in efforts to try to improve your community, et cetera. But the other good news is that there's a high correlation between spirituality and civic engagement. So you're more likely to vote. You're more likely to participate in advocacy, et cetera. And so I think we should celebrate that. And, again, create these on-ramps between those that might be drawn more to a spiritual identity, if you will, back into the church and into new expressions of the church that will need to look differently than kind of the church of the past.
And what is the role of your organization within this? And what do you hope is the leader of the organization that you and your team will be able to accomplish in the next couple of years?
Yeah, so Sojourners has always been this kind of parachurch organization. So we didn't set out to start a new denomination. We're not a church in a formal sense, but we are an organization that does center our Christian identity. And, we work in coalition with lots of other faith traditions and with people that are atheists and agnostic, et cetera. But we really think that it's really important that there is a strong Christian voice and constituency that weaves together a commitment between what we call spiritual renewal and social justice, that these need to be fused, that there's this powerful synergy between spiritual renewal and social justice. And when we are kind of engaged in spiritual renewal, that actually draws us into a deeper commitment to justice. And so, Sojourners, many people know us because of our publications. We started as a magazine, but now we have a digital publication that also produces content. You can access it for free at www.sojo.net. But we also have an advocacy and mobilizing arm that is kind of part of where I see the growth of Sojourners in the future. I want to grow our readers, but I want our readers to also see Sojourners as a vehicle through which they can learn how they can better put their faith into action. So we have campaigns that are focused on immigration reform and immigrant rights. We have a lot of advocacy work that's happening around economic justice and fighting poverty in the United States, but also around the world. We work a huge amount, particularly in the last number of years, around protecting the right to vote and strengthening our democracy. We have a coalition or a kind of a joint campaign through what's called Face United to Save Democracy. And then, certainly work on climate justice and protecting the planet and more. And so, I'm hopeful that more and more Christians of all stripes will come to embrace a commitment to justice and peace as integral to how they live out their faith and really see Sojourners as a primary vehicle through which they can do that.
So are your subscribers and followers, I don't know if it's the right word, but are they the majority Christians? That's one, or do you have other people from other faiths as well, or from non-faith? And then what is the age group that you're attracting?
No, that's a great question. So yes, primarily Christian, although we certainly have some of the nuns are a part of our network and look to us and read our content. We have and do have, some non-Christian authors, including Muslim and Jewish. So, I think in a number of ways, we are at this kind of intersection of multi-faith work, even though, again, the majority of our readership and constituency is Christian. The age really varies. It depends on which kind of part of our work. So our magazine subscribers, certainly skew much older. Some of that is just older people tend to read magazines, and I wish that younger people did too. But we're trying to kind of figure that out as we seek to sustain our magazine, which is still a really crucial part of our work. Our kind of digital readers, so people that come to our website to read content, tend to skew younger. So they're more kind of in our age group, to be honest. From Generation X to millennials, et cetera. I think one of the things that we're really trying to be creative about and trying to be more committed to is figuring out how to reach younger generations, particularly Generation Z and younger. And, we've had some success there, but I think a lot more work needs to be done.
are you then in a way the new church?
Yeah, in some ways, I think that's right. I mean, and I think in some ways, like, we are a platform that is helping or trying to help to catalyze what the church can look like, maybe needs to look like in the next 10 to 20 years. And don't get me wrong, like, I actually am a big believer in the importance of strengthening the church itself. But I also think, as we talked about earlier, the church just needs to adapt, and it needs to develop new wineskins in terms of what church looks like. And as long as Christians or people are able to find community and are able to, in those bonds of community, experience fellowship and intimacy with God, I mean, that to me is kind of what's most important. And then, of course, as I've shared, connecting that to a commitment to justice is really essential, and that's kind of the bread and butter of Sojourners' work.
Hey, Adam, you know that this podcast is a spin-off of a 100-mile walk that I started more than 10 years ago now, 11 or 12. And then 2 years ago, I was not able to, I had to walk alone. So I could not walk with others to talk about life and stuff. So a question that I always ask to my guests in the podcast is, if you would be asked to walk 100 miles in a week, so that is 15 to 20 miles a day, for which cause would you walk and why?
That is a great question. And, I'm inspired by your commitment to walk 100 miles. I would love to actually do that someday.
It gets more and more tough for me, though. But
yeah, no,
not as fast anymore.
For me too.
Years ago.
Yeah, as someone who used to be a runner, I ran all the way through college. So, if I can cheat, I'll give you two issues, because they both come to mind, and I actually think that we can't really address them apart from each other. So the first issue that came to mind is, if I could walk 100 miles and we could pass major legislation that would restore the strength of the restore the strength of the Voting Rights Act, and would make a series of changes to really safeguard what I call the sacred right to vote, to me that would be the first. And I think increasingly our democracy in the United States is under assault. A lot of this was triggered, sadly, by the 2020 election and the kind of big lie that continues to be quite common, that the last election was stolen. But even worse, by a number of efforts across the country to impose new restrictions, new barriers that often disproportionately impact or even targeted toward Black and brown voters. And, I think it's just essential that we, as a nation, kind of reverse that trend and really restore the right to vote. And then beyond that, desperately need to end the gerrymandering of congressional districts. We've now gotten to a point where over 80% of congressional elections are actually determined in the primary and not the general election. Guess who votes in the primaries? It tends to be the most strident, the most extreme voters. And so part of the reason why I think our system is so broken, and it's being fueled by this kind of zero-sum, us versus them mentality, which is, again, very unhealthy for our democracy, is because we've got these structural problems that are helping to fuel this mindset and these trends. And so, a whole series of reforms that I think could help us overcome this crisis of polarization in our politics would be the first one. The second one would be the crisis of climate change. And, there's not necessarily one single policy change necessarily that is going to completely reverse the current trajectory we're on, but I do think if me walking 100 miles could lead to not only a kind of change in mentality and mindset, particularly in the church, that could break us out of this either complacency or, at worst, this kind of mindset of dominionism. In other words, this mindset based on, I think, bad theology, that God granted us as humans the kind of mandate to dominate the earth rather than to care for it and protect it. I think that could then lead to a huge change in political will, and hopefully kind of get the whole issue of climate change and combating climate change through renewable energies and mitigation efforts and adaptation and more out of this kind of partisan box, and literally could become a nonpartisan cause and a bipartisan cause.
Great. And we can walk together for that as well, for those two causes. And just as a reminder for the listeners, I've started to walk, to end hunger and poverty and to end injustice. So, and that's all related with what you just said. I would like to piggyback on both. And the first follow-up question on the first topic that you mentioned is polarization. So I really believe that connecting folks with each other is an important first step for this polarization. So I try to connect my guests. So I would like to share the question of the previous guest. So he has a question. He has a question for you. So hold on, I need to do something from my side, and then it should work.
Yeah, I would like to ask the next person who comes after me really to reflect on, his or her aspirations or wishes for the new year.
I think one of them is, and I've actually been meaning to do this for the last couple of years, so maybe this is kind of a deferred aspiration, but I really want to spend more time, particularly in the South, really talking to more conservative Christians. I have some of those folks in my life, and I'm grateful for that, those relationships and that dialogue. But I do feel like it's important, and this kind of comes back to what we need to do to overcome so much polarization, to listen more deeply and, to spend time outside your comfort zone. And in my case, I'm predominantly in kind of progressive circles, although, again, I certainly engage with and interact with people with very different political perspectives and ideologies. But there are times where I'm just completely baffled by why so many white Christians in particular remain so loyal to the former president, or why, the kind of conspiracy theories that have unfortunately seeped into many parts of the church have become so durable and remain so strong. So in any case, I think that's one. And then the second one is, this is a little bit more institutional inside Sojourners, but we're in the middle of kind of fashioning a 5-year strategic plan for the organization, which I'm really excited about. And so not only do I want to land that strategic plan, get it done by the spring, which would be the early part of the new year, but I really hope that all of us, not just me, can really center and ground that plan in a kind of what I would kind of borrowing from Walter Brueggemann, a sanctified imagination about where we want to see the church, where we want to see the country, where we want to see the world 5 years from now, let alone, much longer than that. And so, I'm pretty hopeful about kind of what we'll come up with, but I want to make sure that it, again, is kind of rooted in a deeper spiritual vision.
Great. And your question for the next guest.
Yeah, I think my question would be, what are some of the spiritual practices? Maybe it's walking 100 miles, but what are some of the spiritual practices that they have found to be the most regenerative and the most transformational for their own kind of life and activism and vocational pursuits?
Great. I like that question. Coming back to your, you mentioning, you're walking for a climate change, to do something about it. So I would like to bring us to something that I try to raise in this podcast as well, and that's around the Sustainable Development Goals. So there, maybe we're going from only, U.S. to the whole world. So, Mike, I have a couple of questions around this. And the first question is, what do you like the listeners to know about the Sustainable Development Goals? That's one. And second is, many say that we will not be able to reach those Sustainable Development Goals, or the fact that we are behind with reaching them has to do with that we never have paid proper attention to the skills, knowledge, and capacity that we need as individuals and as community to work on those goals. And a group of people now came up, for example, with the inner development goals, and there are 5 inner development goals that are developed. Being, thinking, relating, collaborating, and action. So the second part of the question is, what do you think about that? Something like the inner development goals, which is maybe more enablers to reach towards those goals. So 2 parts to this question.
Yeah, well, great question. So for the first one, I am a big fan and champion of the Sustainable Development Goals. I was very active before they were created. At that time, I was leading advocacy efforts for World Vision U.S. and was doing a lot of work to try to ensure that the Sustainable Development Goal agenda, which basically replaced or succeeded the Millennium Development Goal agenda, was as robust and comprehensive as possible. And I was encouraged that the Sustainable Development Goals not only included a goal to end extreme poverty by 2030, but also had a bigger emphasis on combating inequality, included a commitment to address issues of rule of law and governance, included a commitment to address climate change and address environmental sustainability. So, some people argue that the goals are too complicated and too big, but I think given where we are now, we can't separate a commitment to ending extreme poverty from all these other issues. It really requires us to have this more integrated approach. So I actually think it's a strength and not a weakness of the Sustainable Development Goal agenda. I think where the SDGs fall short is that they're not politically binding. They are, essentially, it's up to governments to take them seriously, and it's up to us as civil society to hold government leaders accountable to the SDG agenda. And, I worry that partly because there wasn't concerted enough effort to popularize the goals when they were created. If you ask the vast majority of Americans, and I do this actually in a class that I teach at Pepperdine as an adjunct professor, most young people, let alone people in general, don't know about the Sustainable Development Goals agenda. They don't know that the United States, was a part of creating it and ultimately endorsed it. And so, without that kind of public knowledge, let alone pressure to generate political will, I just fear that, these really amazing aspirational goals will end up in a kind of dustbin of unfulfilled promises. So, that onus is on us, but I think a lot of work needs to be done in that regard. I really love the idea of the inner development goals. I'm less familiar with them until I had a chance to read about them in preparation for this podcast. Yeah. But I think it kind of relates to some of the things that I talk about in my book, A More Perfect Union. The creation of the beloved community is not simply about a series of policy changes, although those are really critical. It's a journey about who we want to be as people, as people of faith, as Christians, and in my case. And it does require a lot of that inner work. It requires, a series of commitments to virtue and to living out a series of values. And so, I think it's really important to kind of link the inner with the outer. And I'm looking forward to learning more about how that's getting realized and kind of lived out. But I definitely support that whole effort.
Music is very important to me, so I always have a music question as well. So if I ask you to come up with a piece of music or a song that best embodies who you are, which song or piece of music would that be and why?
Yeah, so immediately think about the, classic iconic song "One Love" by Bob Marley. And I'm a huge reggae fan. My wife is from Jamaica, so definitely I consider myself an honorary Jamaican, being married to someone from Jamaica. But the reason I love that song is that it really is about interdependence and unity. It's about Ubuntu. I referenced Ubuntu interdependence before, but the reason why I kind of focus so much on Ubuntu, I had a chance to study abroad in South Africa in 1996, just about a year and a half after Nelson Mandela was elected first Black president of South Africa and the end of apartheid took place. And it really was this life-changing, formative experience for me. Being there, studying, I got to witness one of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings. And I really got to see in a very visceral way this whole African concept and philosophy of Ubuntu. Archbishop Desmond Tutu summarized Ubuntu with the simple statement, "I am because we are." And, it really is this understanding that our lives are very much interwoven together. And I can't fully realize my God-given potential unless you are able to fully realize your God-given potential. And to me, it's kind of the golden rule on steroids is the way that I like to paraphrase it. And so this kind of concept of Ubuntu, to me, is what the song "One Love" is all about. And, it's also just a really beautiful, beautiful song.
No, I love that song also. So we will add that to the Spotify playlist that we made. It's called #WalkTalkListen, and there you will find all the songs that have been selected by my guests. I think it's awesome. People heard me say this, but it goes from reggae to hard rock to classical to soul. So it's really cool. If I listen to it, I go through the experience again of having the privilege of talking with so many different people. Adam, these conversations always goes very fast. My last question to you is, any last message, invitation, question for the listeners?
Well, and I don't mean this as a shameless plug, but I invite you certainly to check out my book, A More Perfect Union. A new
Absolutely. So yeah.
But even without reading the book, I mean, part of the reason why I just am so passionate about the beloved community is that it shows up in so many different cultural and faith traditions. I mean, you don't have to necessarily use the words beloved community to still be committed to building the beloved community. I think it really could be this inspiring, unifying narrative, not just from the United States, but also in other parts of the world. But, it shows up in the Jewish understanding of tikkun olam, what it will take to repair the world. It shows up in the Korean understanding of jung, the kind of glue that binds us together. And so, to me, the beloved community is not just about a destination. It's also about the journey to get there. That we, similar to the inner and outer conversation we had around the SDGs, we get to experience deeper connection and community on the way to building the beloved community. And then, of course, the beloved community itself is this kind of expression of our deepest aspirations and deepest values. So, I'm always anxious to engage in further conversation about what it'll look like and what it'll take to build a beloved community. And I just hope that, that moral vision can be inspiring for the listeners that are listening right now, but also, that you'll not just give us some thought, but really think about what does the beloved community mean to you?
Great. Thank you so much for today. I will make sure in the podcast notes all the links are there. I would really encourage people to check out your book because I think it's important, absolutely, and it's worthwhile read. And I think COVID in a way showed us that we're all interdependent, and then we realized that for 2 weeks, and then we went back to to business as usual because the vaccine was there for at least the people in the West. So I think we really need to realize we are really interdependent. We have many challenges ahead of us, in front of us, that we can only solve together. So and it goes beyond the U.S. I mean, as a world, we have to face and solve climate change and name all the others. So thanks a lot, Adam, and good luck with everything you do. And we will keep in touch.
Absolutely. Thank you.
This episode was made possible by the support of an organization called CWS. You want to be part of a movement? Well, sign up to become a sustaining partner. As a sustaining partner, you can make a difference in the world, automatically every month. Sustaining partners commit to a hopeful future by making compassion a part of their monthly budget. It could mean new systems to manage precious resources like water, or diversified ways of earning a living that make people more resilient. For as little as $10 a month, you can transform lives. You want to check it out? Well, go to cwsglobal.org/sustain. Thank you for listening to Walk, Talk, Listen. Please check us out on 100mile.org or follow us on Facebook or Instagram.